Welcome to the Friends of the Earth System Change webinar series. This aims to facilitate learners to connect the dots between global justice issues, to drive the root causes of injustice and reflect on action pathways, while also amplifying the work being done by groups locally and around the world. Today, we're delighted to welcome Gabi Velasco. Gabi is a policy analyst in the Research to Action Lab at the Urban Institute, where they research environmental justice, housing justice, and economic mobility. Before joining Urban, they worked with the sustainability program at the Texas Department of Parks and Wildlife, providing research and project management support across the state. Gabi Velasco received a BA in Sustainability Studies, a BA in Urban Political Ecology, and a minor in Women's and Gender Studies from the University of Texas at Austin. While at the University of Texas, Gabi conducted research on environmental racism, zoning, and children's health in East Austin, and was published in the peer-reviewed journal GeoHumanities. So we're delighted to have Gabi's insight for the System Change series. I'll pass over to Gabi now. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Evelyn. Great. So welcome and thank you again to Friends of the Earth Ireland for inviting me to talk with y'all today about my research on environmental justice and also housing justice a bit. So as Evelyn said, my name is Gabi Velasco. I use they and them pronouns, and I'm a policy analyst at the Urban Institute's Research to Action Lab in Washington, D.C., USA. For those of you not familiar with the Urban Institute, we are a 50-year-old nonprofit social and economic policy research organization based in Washington, D.C. We conduct policy research and analysis, provide strategic advising and assistance to help stakeholders achieve better outcomes, and convene researchers, policymakers, practitioners, and advocates to discuss new evidence and share promising practices. Briefly, I just want to go over the agenda for the webinar. First, I'm going to go over a primer to environmental justice and then housing justice. And once we have a shared understanding of those two fields, we'll talk about how they're connected and why the success of one depends on the success of the other. Then we'll go through some strategies for coordinated environmental and housing action, and we'll end with time for some informal discussion and Q&A. As a note, my presentation will be kept pretty high level, but there are lots of points to pick up on for continued conversation and personal research. Rather than exhaustively try and cover environmental justice in both my geography of expertise, the US, and yours, Ireland, I instead opted to discuss some fundamentals of the field with points for you to pick up on in your own research or after in the discussion following my presentation. So to kick off, what is environmental justice? So in 1982, in Warren County, North Carolina in the US, grassroots protests led by Black activists pushed environmental justice into broader public consciousness and national media attention. Central to environmental justice advocacy and organizing is the assertion that communities of color are disproportionately burdened by the violences of environmental pollution and other negative environmental externalities of capitalism. The environmental justice movement also pushes for the recognition and manifestation of individuals' entitlement to a clean environment as a basic human right. The rise of industrialization brought with it the negative capitalist externalities of hazardous waste and pollution that were normally situated in low-income communities, usually communities of color in the US or on tribal lands, out of sight from more affluent white populations. These communities have become known as sacrifice zones, permanently impacted by environmental degradation through unwanted land uses and pollution. As scholar Naomi Klein shared, running an economy on energy sources and industries that release poison as an unavoidable part of their extraction and refining has always required sacrifice zones, whole subsets of humanity categorized as less than fully human, which made their poisoning in the name of progress somehow acceptable. So environmental justice requires that we acknowledge that the choices of environmental allocation, conservation, and mitigation that governments make are usually made for the explicit benefit of those with social, economic, and political power. Environmental justice also requires attention beyond pollution towards the ways that racial and socioeconomic inequities influence increased vulnerability to climate change impacts. For example, heat islands, water scarcity, and lack of food access, and also limit participation in urban greening, green economies, and new green technologies. Environmental justice also necessitates a more holistic pursuit of justice, including calls for Indigenous land back on colonized lands and racial, LGBTQ, and disability justice, since environmental degradation has differential impacts for different populations. So after decades of organizing, environmental justice is still a top concern globally, and it's because the obstacles to achieving it are steep and are made intentionally so. One issue is that mainstream environmental movements often seek to address the most visibly problematic aspects of environmental degradation and capitalism, and also structural racism, without fundamentally challenging the structures or the way the government works to maintain them. Environmental justice communities were created through historical processes, and they remain so through the maintenance of the status quo. Conceding that some government-centric strategies may be necessary for immediate short-term harm mitigation efforts due to resources and scope, these strategies are insufficient in achieving and can also be argued to inhibit structural change in pursuit of environmental justice, since the state plays an undeniably central role in perpetuating environmental injustice. And while progress has definitely been made, this progress has been slow and it lacks the necessary teeth to bring tangible results for impacted communities. And when bold action has been attempted, the biggest polluting corporations often squash action with lawsuits. Also, mainstream environmentalism that's accepted by the general public has often led with individual actions, like turning the lights off when you leave a room, recycling and reusable water bottles, rather than trying to organize for radical systems change. Individual actions are definitely important, but they don't address the scale of the issue at hand. And one specific area that my research is focused on is also the environmental justice impacts of coastal flooding, which is also a climate justice issue, as climate change will differentially impact people. So in coastal towns and cities, affordable housing is often located in low elevation areas vulnerable to the effects of climate change, like flooding and rising sea levels. This housing tends to not be up to modern housing codes, be of poorer quality than other housing, and is also subject to deferred maintenance and structural problems. And flooding, even at low levels, can devastate households by damaging belongings, disrupting utilities, contaminating water, and generating mold. Many residents of these units in the US are socioeconomically vulnerable. They have low incomes and are more likely to be people of color, disabled, or seniors. And they're particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change because they have fewer financial assets, less political power, and are less connected to information about disaster recovery aid. The combination of the physical vulnerability of affordable housing units, socioeconomic vulnerability, and increasingly frequent flooding due to climate change presents a serious threat to residents of already scarce affordable housing stock. So I'm now going to move on to the second bit of the puzzle that my research deals with, which is housing justice. So why even bring housing into the conversation? It was true before COVID-19, and it will be true after. A safe, decent home provides a solid foundation in life and strengthens more than just residents. However, housing markets don't provide safe, decent homes at all income levels, and they aren't race neutral. That's where policy needs to intervene. Learned and lived expertise shows that housing is central to opportunities and outcomes in life. Housing stability and safety influence a range of factors for individuals and communities, including health, economic mobility, neighborhood safety, educational opportunity, and well-being. Housing can also be a key point of influence to address disinvestment and segregation in pursuit of racial equity. And the range of issues that unstable or inequitable housing systems produce are wide-ranging and intimately felt by residents. Acute short-term outcomes like eviction and homelessness are connected to declines in health, both mental and physical, difficulties in employment, and a reduced sense of belonging and autonomy. These have impacts over a lifetime, including lower earnings, lower assets, higher health costs, and shorter lifespans. So housing justice is built on the central tenet that every single person has a human right to a safe, stable, healthy home. The movement pushes for system change to transform housing from an exploitable, profitable industry to a community necessity. Housing justice requires housing systems change. It's a call to transform our housing system from a market asset-based privilege that is commodified and profited from to a universally insured right. Rather than make housing policy decisions based on the wants of real estate developers and landlords, housing justice asserts that we need policy driven by the needs of residents, tenants, and communities. And the dominant policy narratives in this space are often on housing affordability and access. And while these are definitely important pieces of the puzzle, they're insufficient in achieving justice as they don't address root causes, including capitalism and white supremacist racism, of why our housing system does not house everyone. We need actions that don't further privatize and commodify housing, and instead put housing in the control of communities. So similar to environmental justice, and I'd argue all justice-centered movements, housing justice necessitates a concurrent focus on racial, LGBTQ, and disability justice, among others. Indigenous land back is also essential, especially in heavily colonized places like the United States. Housing justice organizers work towards the decommodification of housing and securing housing as a tangible, universal human right. This is done through measures like tenant organizing, eviction prevention, anti-displacement initiatives, and increasing community ownership of land and property. And housing justice faces similar challenges to environmental justice. It's the old and constant story of people versus power. So why have I spent 10 minutes talking about two kinds of justice and how do they come together? Well, for one, housing is one of the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases. Residential buildings account for 20% of greenhouse gas emissions in the US, and residential buildings are responsible for over 30% of energy use and energy-related GHG emissions globally. Emitting sectors of this scale require some serious and sustained attention. And most housing serves the necessary function of providing shelter, but it is often energy inefficient and is adjacent to sites of environmental injustice, exposing residents to health hazards, including air and water pollution. And in this section, I'm also going to drop in some links and screen grabs of research done by one of the projects I'm involved in at the Urban Institute, the Housing Matters Research Portal, which has spent a lot of time covering the climate housing intersection. As I mentioned earlier, toxic sites have historically and presently been way more abundant in communities of color and low-income communities. One dimension of this that isn't always considered is that being sited in communities means being sited in people's homes. This is near the places where people spend the majority of their lives, where they eat, where they sleep, where their children play, where they live. This consistent exposure dramatically increases rates of cancer, asthma, cardiovascular illness, and developmental disabilities. And as climate change progresses, where people live will impact their vulnerability and their exposure to climate change impacts. Housing developers in cities value the benefits parks and green spaces add to an area because they drive economic development and they transform neighborhoods. However, by contributing to increasing property values, these green amenities can also present risk for lower income residents and price them out of their neighborhoods. So I want to end by touching on strategies for coordinated environmental and housing justice action that have come up as particularly promising in my research. But first, let me say that the work that I focus on is on non-reformist reforms, which is a bit of a mouthful to say, but basically it's just a framework that acknowledges that social movements need to account for and work towards immediate harm mitigation that uses the existing inequitable system. However, the steps and reforms taken for these short-term gains should not further bolster that system, and we must simultaneously build strength for a wider struggle, eventually culminating in radical change. So one way, which I know has already been discussed in the Systems Change series, is social housing. And social housing, which through federal acquisitions can help decommodify housing, also keeps housing out of speculative real estate. And I'm not going to spend too much time here as this is much more familiar in Europe and is much more new in the US. But in the US, we don't have social housing programs, and this is a really promising area for policy development, especially for social housing developments that are coupled with green retrofitting, as well as environmental justice measures like lead pipe remediation. Community land trusts and other forms of collective ownership are also key. Community land trusts are usually based on nonprofit organizations that serve as the vehicles for collective community ownership of land governed by a board of directors, including community resident representation. Land trust organizations are part of a broader shared equity housing sector, typically developing, selling, and stewarding affordable homes that provide security and stability for low and moderate income families. Community land trusts are especially impactful when they can steward land on behalf of the community for the uses desired by a majority of local residents, including leading work towards environmental cleanup caused by polluters and ensuring that park space is developed for the benefit of all in the community. And community engagement is also essential in all housing and environmental plans and programs. Community engagement needs to be rethought of as community leadership and ownership and happen at the outset of any green-based project and through its life cycle to ensure project design and implementation happen and align with community needs and vision. Energy justice is also a really essential topic to consider, especially for climate justice. Retrofitting existing housing is especially important for reducing that 30% greenhouse gas emissions portion we discussed earlier. And this is something that national governments have been pretty keen to do. Ireland is one such country, and the government pledged to retrofit 30% of the housing stock to be less polluting and more efficient by 2030. And as we move towards a more energy efficient future, we also need to make sure that low-income residents benefit equally from this renewable energy transition through measures like energy subsidies. And above all else, collective action and solidarity are key to achieving visions of housing and environmental justice. Everything I've shared is a product of the organizing of billions of people organized for justice globally. There's so many lessons we can share with each other and so much to learn. And it's essential we build movements for community power and power where violent forces like capitalism and racism and sexism have tried to take away agency from people. Ultimately, we care about environmental and housing justice because we care about our families, our neighbors, our communities, and people all around the world who we may never know, but with whom we can empathize the necessity of a safe planet and a stable home. So thank you so much for your time. It's been a delight talking with you all, and we'll end with an open-ended opportunity for some questions and discussion. And thank you again.
Thank you so much, Gabby. That was extremely clear that you addressed global issues, you brought it into an Irish context, and so many of the issues you touched upon will be so familiar to people considering this from the Irish context. And I thank you so much for bringing in that perspective as well. And this is a really important issue to address because engaging with our participants, particularly regarding this series, it was really interesting to see that regarding accommodation and housing, this was listed as a really high priority for something that people wanted to address and learn more about, but it was a lot lower with people saying they had less of a background understanding of it than other issues. So it's really great that we have this as a resource, and thank you for sharing your resources on the screen there. So I'm going to add those links for people watching this recording that they can look at the description and click on the links attached to it to learn more about these issues. And thank you so much. I think that's a fantastic summary of so many different issues and really inspiring to tell us to take collective action and take the power and give it to the people as opposed to having the people fight the power.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Evelyn. It was so great talking to you all.